The first time I ever said my sister's name out loud in public, it wasn't to introduce her or to brag about her achievements. It was to object at her wedding. But before you think I'm just bitter or jealous, let me tell you the story from the very beginning. My name is Madeline, and I never imagined that I would one day stand in the middle of a church, staring at the man I once planned to marry, watching him place a ring on my sister's finger while my entire family told me to stay quiet. I am sharing this because people often say family is everything, but sometimes family can break you in ways no stranger ever could. The moment that afternoon still burns in my memory. The organ music was swelling, the guests were standing, and my sister walked down the aisle in a lace gown that looked like it was designed for royalty. On her arm was the man who had once whispered to me about forever. My chest tightened until it was painful to breathe, and I gripped the edge of the pew just to stay upright. Then I felt my mother's hand on my wrist, her nails pressing against my skin, and she whispered so only I could hear, "Do not make a scene." I swallowed hard, my throat raw, but inside I was already unraveling. Because when the pastor asked if anyone objected, my silence would mean surrender. And surrender was something I could no longer live with. That moment did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of years of quiet betrayals, of being overlooked, of being told to be the bigger person while my sister took whatever she wanted. But never in my darkest thoughts did I imagine she would take the man I planned to marry. I am telling this because people often ask why victims of betrayal stay silent. The truth is, silence is survival. Until the day silence becomes too heavy to carry. That day began like any other wedding morning. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Chapel, spilling colors across the polished wood floor. Guests whispered in hushed tones, adjusting ties and smoothing dresses. The scent of roses drifted from the altar arrangements, sweet and suffocating at the same time. I sat in the third pew, my hands folded in my lap, pretending I was calm. On the outside, I looked like any other guest. Inside, I was a storm. My sister Hannah had always been the favorite. Blonde hair, green eyes, a smile that made people forgive her instantly. I was the quieter one, the one who worked hard, studied late, and believed that effort would be enough. Growing up, it was always Hannah who got the compliments, the attention, the last slice of cake. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that one day I would have something that was truly mine. When I met Daniel, tall, dark-haired, with the kind of laugh that filled a room, I thought that day had finally come. He proposed after 2 years together, and I said yes with tears in my eyes. I thought I had won my own happiness at last. But Hannah was not done taking. The betrayal unfolded slowly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. First, I noticed the long text exchanges between them, which Daniel dismissed as just advice about jewelry. Then came the excuses. Late nights at work, canceled dinners, phone calls he would take outside. When I confronted him, he laughed it off, kissed my forehead, and said, "Don't be paranoid." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Until the day Hannah herself sent me an invitation with embossed gold letters. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Hannah Grace and Daniel Carter. My fiancé, my sister, together." And I was invited to watch. I nearly tore the envelope in half. My first instinct was to throw it away, to pretend it had never arrived. But the weight of that card in my hand felt like a challenge, a declaration that I was powerless. So I kept it. I circled the date on my calendar. And when the morning came, I dressed in a simple navy dress, pinned my hair back, and drove to the chapel with my stomach twisting. I told myself I would sit quietly, that I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. But deep down, I knew something inside me would not allow silence forever. The pews creaked as people shifted, waiting for the bride. I could feel the heat rising to my face, my palms damp. The air smelled faintly of perfume and candle wax, and every note of the organ pressed heavier on my chest. When the doors opened and Hannah appeared, radiant and glowing, I felt as though ice water had been poured over my head. Daniel's eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and I thought I saw shame there. Or maybe it was fear. Then he looked away. "Do not make a scene," my mother hissed again, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug crescents into my palms. I told myself to breathe, to stay still. But then the pastor's voice rang out. If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace. The words hung in the air like a dare. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think. Forever hold your peace. Forever. And that was when I knew. Silence was no longer an option. What happened next is the reason I am telling this story. Because in that moment, I stood up. The morning of that wedding was supposed to feel like any other celebration, but to me it felt like walking into a trap. St. Augustine's Chapel had always been a place where people whispered prayers, where couples posed for photographs on manicured steps, where sunlight streamed through colored glass in perfect silence. On that day, the building smelled of roses and beeswax polish. The air was thick with perfume from guests brushing past each other in the narrow aisles. Every shuffle of fabric, every click of a camera shutter, grated against my nerves like sandpaper. I sat in the third pew staring at the altar where white lilies curled over golden vases, trying to steady my breath. Hannah had chosen everything with precision. Her gown sparkled under the stained glass as though it had been stitched from light itself. Daniel wore a charcoal suit tailored so sharply it looked like it could cut through glass. To everyone else, they looked radiant, the picture of joy. To me, it felt staged, a cruel performance I had been forced to attend. What people did not see was the history wrapped around every detail. They did not see how many times I had been told to step aside so Hannah could shine. They did not know that the bouquet she held reminded me of the one I had once circled in a magazine when Daniel and I were planning our own wedding. The guests were a mix of extended relatives, college friends, and neighbors who had watched us grow up. I could hear the hiss of whispers ripple through the pews when I walked in earlier that morning. Some smiles were warm but strained. Others avoided my eyes entirely. I knew what they were thinking. They had received the same invitation I had, with my sister's name entwined with Daniel's in embossed gold letters. They must have wondered what it meant for me. They must have gossiped behind closed doors. Still, none of them said a word. I had not spoken to Hannah in weeks before that day. The last time I heard her voice was on the phone, breezy and unapologetic, when she said, "You'll come, won't you? It's important for family to be there." The words landed like a knife. She was not asking, she was ordering, as though my attendance were part of her stage directions. I wanted to hang up, but instead I said yes, my voice hollow. Part of me hoped she would hear the silence in my tone, that she would reconsider. She never did. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, my parents barely mentioned it. When they did, they spoke as though it was an ordinary event, something inevitable. My mother hummed while folding napkins into boxes for the reception. My father talked about the seating chart as though it were a puzzle he enjoyed. Neither of them acknowledged the obvious, that the groom was once mine. They pretended it was natural, as though family loyalty meant silencing my heartbreak. That silence weighed on me every time I walked into their house. Even the smallest details hinted at what was coming. The invitation was addressed not to Madeline and guest, but only to me, as if announcing that I would arrive alone. At the rehearsal dinner, which I attended for reasons I cannot fully explain, the place cards were arranged with cruel precision. Hannah sat at the head table with Daniel, beaming for photographs, while my name was tucked at the far end beside distant cousins I barely knew. I forced a smile when relatives asked casual questions, but every word tasted like ash. The morning of the wedding, I remember standing in front of my mirror, smoothing down the navy dress I had chosen. It was simple, almost plain, but I could not bring myself to wear anything brighter. My reflection looked unfamiliar, like a woman rehearsing for a role she had never agreed to play. My stomach twisted with dread as I slipped on my shoes. The drive to the chapel was only 15 minutes, yet every mile felt like a countdown. Inside the chapel, the contrast between expectation and reality grew sharper with every moment. Guests leaned in to greet each other warmly, their voices filled with joy. They clapped when the string quartet began to play. They craned their necks to watch Hannah glide down the aisle. To them, it was a love story unfolding in perfect rhythm. To me, it was betrayal stitched into lace and vows. My body felt rigid, my shoulders locked as if holding back a storm. The pew beneath me was polished to a shine, smooth beneath my fingertips. I clutched it until my knuckles blanched white. The organ notes swelled louder, shaking through my chest. I glanced at Daniel. For the briefest instant, his eyes met mine, and I thought I saw hesitation. It flickered and was gone, replaced by a practiced smile as he looked toward the altar. That flicker was enough to twist the knife deeper. My mother's hand tightened on my wrist. Her perfume mixed with the roses, dizzying and sweet. "Do not make a scene," she hissed. The words were delivered with the same practiced authority she had used my whole life whenever Hannah needed protecting. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it above the music. I nodded outwardly, but inside I was breaking. When the pastor finally spoke the words, "If anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace," time seemed to freeze. Every detail sharpened, the creak of wooden pews, the rustle of dresses, the faint cough from the back row. My throat tightened. "Forever hold your peace." The phrase rang like a sentence. In that moment, I realized the full weight of my family's betrayal. They had not only allowed Hannah to take what was mine, they expected me to sit quietly while she paraded it in front of me. That day was never about celebration. It was about erasure. I was supposed to be erased from the story entirely. And as I sat there, the silence pressed heavier and heavier until it felt like drowning. I could no longer breathe beneath it. That was when the decision formed inside me, as sharp and undeniable as a blade. I knew I would stand. I knew I would speak. The only question left was what would happen after the words left my mouth. This was not the first time Hannah had taken something that belonged to me. That is why, as I sat in that pew, my fists clenched and my heart pounding, the weight of years pressed down heavier than the music echoing through the chapel. I was not just fighting the betrayal of one wedding. I was remembering every quiet theft, every smile she wore when she got away with it, every time my parents told me to be the bigger person. To understand why I stood up that day, you need to know what came before. When I was 10 years old, I saved up my allowance for months to buy a bike. I cleaned neighbors' yards, watered plants, and walked dogs until my knees ached. I wanted that bike more than anything because it represented independence. The day I finally bought it, gleaming blue paint and silver handlebars, I thought I had earned something of my own. 2 weeks later, Hannah decided she liked it. She was only a year younger than me, but she had a way of turning every desire into a demand. She cried until my parents gave in, and suddenly the bike was hers. I was told, "You're older, Madeline. You'll understand." I walked to school while Hannah pedaled past me with ribbons fluttering in the wind. Years later, in high school, I auditioned for the school play. I practiced lines every night, rehearsed in front of the mirror until my voice cracked. I wanted that role because it was finally a chance to be seen, not just as Hannah's sister, but as myself. When the cast list went up, my name was there for the lead. For one glorious afternoon, I felt like I mattered. Then Hannah stormed into the drama teacher's office in tears, claiming I had pressured her not to audition. By the next morning, the part had been reassigned to her. Once again, I was told to be proud of her success, as if my own loss was irrelevant. Even in college, the pattern repeated. I dated a boy named Christopher for a short time. He was kind, thoughtful, and actually listened when I spoke. It felt new and fragile, something worth protecting. Hannah came to visit me one weekend, and by Monday, he had stopped calling. A month later, I saw photographs of the two of them together at a campus party. When I confronted her, she laughed and said, "You weren't serious about him anyway." My parents brushed it off as youthful drama. I learned to swallow the anger like medicine that never healed anything. The cruelest part was not that Hannah took what she wanted. It was that my parents always defended her. My mother would say, "She's just spirited." My father would add, "You're stronger, Madeline. You can handle it." Their words were meant to soothe, but they cut deeper than silence. They painted me as resilient, but resilience was just another word for neglected. Each time, I told myself to move forward, to let it go, to find something else that could not be stolen. But the list of losses grew longer, until even I could not ignore the pattern. Daniel was supposed to be different. When he and I met, I thought I had finally escaped the cycle. He noticed me. Not Hannah, not the golden child, but me. He laughed at my jokes, remembered the small details of my day, held my hand in a way that made the world shrink to just the two of us. When he proposed under the old oak tree in the park, I felt as though the universe had given me back everything I had lost. For once, I was chosen. I clung to that belief even when the signs began to appear. The late-night messages, the way he suddenly seemed distracted when I spoke, the excuses that grew thinner with every week, deep down I knew. But denial is a powerful shield. I told myself it was stress, that work had consumed him, that Hannah's presence at family gatherings was just coincidence. I wanted so badly to hold on to the dream that I ignored the evidence. Until the day that ivory envelope arrived with their names linked together in gold. It was not just betrayal. It was confirmation that history had repeated itself on the grandest scale yet. As I sat in that chapel, the organ vibrating through my chest, I remembered each of these moments like snapshots in my mind. The bike, the play, Christopher, Daniel. Each memory layered over the last until they formed a mountain of resentment too heavy to bear. I realized this wedding was not a beginning for them. It was the climax of a story that had started long ago, when I first learned that my sister's wants would always outweigh my needs. People often ask why I did not walk away sooner, why I did not cut ties. The answer is complicated. Family is a chain that binds even when it burns. I wanted to believe they would change. I wanted to believe love could outlast cruelty. And most of all, I wanted to believe I mattered enough to fight for. That hope kept me tethered, even when I should have let go. But sitting there, surrounded by flowers and whispers, the truth settled on me like a final verdict. This was not about love anymore. This was about erasure. If I stayed silent, I would vanish from my own life, written out of the story entirely. The weight of the past pressed against me until it felt like drowning. And that is why when the pastor's voice rang out with the words, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," I knew silence was no longer an option. The words had barely left the pastor's lips when I felt my body move before my mind could catch up. My knees trembled as I rose from the pew, the sound of wood scraping against polished floor echoing through the silence. Every head turned at once. Dozens of faces shifting from confusion to shock. My pulse roared so loudly I could hardly hear myself as I spoke. I object. My voice cracked at first, but the words rang through the chapel with a weight that silenced the whispers instantly. Hannah's eyes snapped toward me, wide with disbelief. Daniel froze at the altar, his hand still gripping hers. For the first time in years, I saw fear flicker across both their faces. The pastor blinked in stunned silence, clutching his book tighter as though he wasn't sure what to do next. My mother gasped, the sound sharp enough to slice through the stillness, while my father muttered my name like a warning. But I had already crossed the line. My chest burned with adrenaline, my hands shaking, but I forced the words out. This man standing beside my sister was once my fiancé. We were engaged. He promised me forever before she decided to take him for herself. The weight of the truth hung in the air, undeniable and poisonous. A ripple of whispers spread through the guests, some gasping, others exchanging looks of disbelief. Hannah's mouth opened and closed like she was grasping for air. Finally, her voice broke the silence, shrill and furious. "You're lying! You're pathetic!" But her trembling hands gave her away. She yanked her fingers from Daniel's grip as though the contact burned. Daniel's face turned pale, his jaw tightening. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff with nowhere left to step. "I'm not lying," I said, louder now, my voice steadying as though each word built a wall beneath my feet. "I have the messages. I have the photographs. Everyone here deserves to know what kind of marriage this really is." My words cracked like thunder, and the crowd reacted. My aunt covered her mouth with both hands. My uncle leaned forward, shaking his head slowly. Even the children seated near the back fell silent, sensing the weight of what had just erupted. The organ player had stopped mid-note, leaving the chapel drenched in the heavy hum of tension. The scent of roses and candle wax now felt suffocating. I could feel the air thicken as Hannah's face flushed red with rage. She stormed down the steps of the altar toward me, her gown dragging across the floor like a storm cloud. "How dare you?" she screamed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You've ruined everything." No, Hannah, I answered, my voice surprisingly calm, almost steady in contrast to her hysteria. You ruined everything the moment you decided betrayal was worth more than blood. You could have had any man, but you chose mine. And you thought I would sit quietly while you pretended this was love. My words struck her like a slap. She stumbled back a step, her mouth opening but no words coming out. Daniel finally spoke, his voice breaking like glass. Madeline, please stop. His tone wasn't anger, it was desperation. He knew the truth could not be buried anymore. He knew his carefully constructed facade had shattered. The guests leaned in, waiting for more, their curiosity laced with horror. I turned toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time since he had betrayed me. Stop? I repeated, my chest tightening. You want me to stop after you looked me in the eye, slid a ring on my finger, and promised me a life you never intended to keep? You want me to stop after you let me dream while you whispered the same promises to her? The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Daniel's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of his guilt had finally crushed him. Hannah looked between us, her lips trembling, realization dawning that the fairy tale image she had tried to paint was dissolving in front of everyone she had invited to admire her. From the corner of my eye, I saw my mother rise from her seat, her face hard with anger. Sit down, Madeline, she hissed, her voice sharp with fury. You're humiliating this family. I turned to her, my heart pounding, and answered clearly enough for everyone to hear. No, Mother. I am not humiliating this family. You all did that when you let this happen and pretended it was normal. The collective gasp from the pews was almost physical, like a wave breaking against stone. My father lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. My mother froze, her lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not answer. The pastor cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control. Perhaps we should, he began, but the room erupted into voices. Guests began murmuring, some standing, others pointing toward Hannah and Daniel. The orderly beauty of the wedding collapsed into chaos. Hannah screamed again, tears streaking her makeup, her voice shaking with fury. You couldn't stand that I had something you didn't. You've always been jealous of me, Madeline. Jealousy. The word rang in my ears like an insult and a curse. I laughed, not with humor, but with disbelief. Jealous? Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I envied betrayal and lies? You can keep the man who threw away his vows before he even made them. What I want is freedom, from both of you. My words landed like a stone tossed into a still pond, rippling through every soul in the room. For the first time, Daniel spoke without excuses. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. She's right, he said, his eyes fixed on the floor. I was engaged to Madeline first. I broke it off for Hannah. I thought it would be easier if she didn't know the whole truth. The collective gasp was deafening. Some guests rose to leave, others shook their heads in disbelief. Hannah's face crumpled as though the ground had split beneath her. The wedding had collapsed, the illusion torn apart. As I stood there, trembling but unbroken, I realized I was not the one humiliated. The truth had shifted the weight from my shoulders onto theirs. I had carried silence long enough. Now it was their turn to bear the consequences. The chapel erupted after Daniel's confession. It was as though the walls themselves had cracked open and spilled out years of secrets. Guests rose from their seats, some shouting, some whispering fiercely to each other, and others scrambling for the doors as if fleeing a fire. The carefully arranged flowers, the polished pews, the glowing candles, all of it now looked like stage props in a performance that had collapsed. I stood in the center of it, my breath coming fast, my heart still pounding, but for the first time in years, I felt steady. Hannah staggered back toward the altar, her veil slipping from her hair. Her face was streaked with makeup, her eyes wild as though the truth had struck her harder than any slap could. She turned on Daniel, clawing at his arm. You coward, you were supposed to deny it. Her voice was shrill, cracked with fury, loud enough that even those at the back of the chapel could hear every word. Daniel pulled away, his face ashen. I couldn't, he said, his voice breaking. Not after everything she said. It's true, Hannah. You know it's true. The gasp that followed from the guests was louder than the organ had ever been. My mother moved toward me, her heels clicking against the stone floor. Her face was pale with rage, her lips drawn tight. Madeline, she hissed, her voice low but sharp. Enough of this. Stop humiliating us." Her hand reached for my arm, but I stepped back, refusing to be silenced. "I'm not humiliating anyone but the people who let this happen," I said clearly, my voice echoing off the walls. "You should have stopped it long before today." For once, my father did not look at me with disappointment. Instead, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the floor. I realized he was not angry, he was ashamed. That acknowledgement gave me strength. I turned back toward Hannah and Daniel. "You wanted to make a spectacle," I told them. "And now you have one. Not the fairy tale you scripted, but the truth." The pastor attempted to speak, his voice trembling. "Perhaps we should take a moment." But he was drowned out by the crowd. Some of Hannah's bridesmaids were crying, mascara running down their faces. My uncle shouted something about disgrace. A cousin muttered loudly that he had suspected all along. The chaos swirled like a storm, and at the center of it, Hannah crumbled. She dropped to her knees, her bouquet scattering petals across the aisle, and screamed at Daniel, "You ruined this." Her hands pounded the floor, her gown pooling around her like a collapsed curtain. Daniel bent down, his voice low, but I was close enough to hear. "No, Hannah. You ruined this when you betrayed your own sister." He stood and walked toward the exit, leaving her on the floor. Gasps followed him, whispers trailing like shadows, until the heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind him. Hannah's scream echoed after him, raw and piercing. She turned on me, her face twisted with hatred. "This is your fault," she spat, her voice breaking. "You couldn't let me have one thing without destroying it." Her words hung in the air, but I no longer flinched. I had flinched my entire life. Now I stood firm. "One thing?" I said quietly, though my voice carried in the silence that followed. "Hannah, you've taken everything, and I let you, but not anymore." The words seemed to drain the fight out of her. She slumped to the floor, sobbing, her gown spread across the steps like a fallen queen stripped of her crown. My mother knelt beside her, murmuring comforts, while guests gathered their belongings and slipped away, shaking their heads. Some cast me sympathetic glances, others looked at me with pity, but none of them denied the truth anymore. As the chapel emptied, the quiet that followed was almost eerie. The candles flickered against stone walls, petals lay scattered across the floor, and the scent of roses was heavy with decay. My father finally spoke, his voice rough. "Madeline," he said, looking at me for the first time that day, "I should have protected you." The words nearly broke me because they were too late, yet they were also the first acknowledgement I had ever heard from him. I nodded, my throat tight, unable to answer. I walked slowly toward the doors, my heels clicking on the polished floor, each step lighter than the last. Behind me, I could still hear Hannah's sobs echoing through the hollowed-out ceremony. But I did not turn back. For once, I was not the one left behind. Outside, the air was sharp and cool, the late afternoon sun streaking the sky with orange and gold. Guests lingered on the steps, murmuring in clusters, their eyes following me as I passed. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others gave small nods of respect. For the first time, their stares did not feel like judgment. They felt like recognition. I drew in a deep breath, the first clean breath I had taken all day. The weight that had pressed on my chest for years seemed to lift, piece by piece, until I could finally stand tall. The chapel doors closed behind me with a heavy thud, sealing away the wreckage I had left inside. I walked to my car, unlocked the door, and sat for a long moment in silence. My hands trembled, my heart still raced, but there was a steadiness in me that I had never known before. I realized then that this was not just the end of Hannah's wedding. It was the end of her shadow over my life. By speaking out, I had reclaimed something she could never steal: my voice, my truth, my freedom. The consequences for her and for Daniel would unfold in time, but for me, the decision was already made. I would no longer carry the silence they had forced on me. I would no longer shrink to make space for someone else's lies. That day, I walked away, not as the broken sister or the abandoned fiancé, but as Madeline, the woman who finally chose herself. When I left the chapel that day, the cool air on my face felt like a rebirth. For years, I had been carrying silence like a stone chained to my chest, and speaking the truth had finally shattered it. But the aftermath of that moment rippled further than I imagined. In the days that followed, word spread through family, friends, and neighbors faster than wildfire. Some called me brave, others called me cruel, But for the first time, I was no longer invisible. I had stepped out of Hannah's shadow, and there was no going back. At home, the silence was deafening. My mother refused to call me, and when I tried to reach her, she answered once with a voice cold as glass, "You humiliated us." Then she hung up. My father, however, called late one evening. His voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "I should have stopped this years ago, Madeline," he admitted. "I should have protected you from her, from all of it." His words were late, but they mattered. They told me that at least one person in that house had finally seen me. Daniel never tried to contact me again. Through whispers and secondhand stories, I learned he left town within a week, his career and reputation unraveling. Hannah stayed, but she withdrew from everyone. My cousin told me she had canceled all social events, hiding behind closed curtains in the house she once filled with parties and laughter. For the first time, she was living with the consequences of her own choices instead of leaving me to carry them. I did not celebrate her downfall. Instead, I mourned what we might have been if she had ever chosen love over envy. I grieved the childhood where I wished we could have been allies instead of rivals. But I also understood something vital. People show you who they are long before you admit it to yourself. Hannah had always taken, and I had always given. That pattern only ended when I decided it had to. The lesson I carried with me was not about weddings or betrayals, but about silence. Silence is not peace. Silence is not strength. Silence is a cage built from fear and obligation. Speaking out broke that cage, and even though the world around me crumbled for a time, I found something stronger in its place: freedom. I learned that the moment you stop living for other people's approval, you begin to breathe for yourself. There were nights after the wedding when I lay awake, replaying everything. The look on Hannah's face, the sound of Daniel's voice cracking, the collective gasp of the crowd, it haunted me. But slowly, those images lost their power. They became reminders of the day I chose myself, not scars of shame. I realized that even pain can transform into strength when you refuse to let it define you. Life did not magically become easier. Relationships with my family are still strained, and holidays carry a tension that no decorations can cover. But I face them differently now. I no longer bow my head when Hannah enters the room. I no longer shrink into the background to keep the peace. I speak when I need to speak, and I protect the boundaries I should have set long ago. For the first time, I am living my own story instead of being erased from it. If you are listening to my story right now, I want you to remember this: you do not owe silence to anyone who harms you. Family, friends, or lovers. Loyalty should never mean losing yourself. If you feel the weight of betrayal pressing on your chest, if you feel like you have been forced into the background of your own life, know that you have the right to step forward. It will hurt. People will call you selfish, dramatic, or cruel. But your voice belongs to you, and no one has the right to steal it. When I walked out of that chapel, I thought I had lost everything: my family, my sister, my fiancé. But looking back, I realized I had only shed what was never truly mine to begin with. What I gained was worth far more: dignity, truth, and the power to finally stand tall as Madeline. If my story held your attention, if it made you think about your own voice, I hope you carry this lesson with you. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories of courage, betrayal, and the strength to rise again, I invite you to stay with me. Subscribe and join this space where voices like ours are never silenced again.